Logan is, of course, a 2017 movie that's, at the time of this review, just been released, and I'm a huge fan of, as many people are, Wolverine, Logan, Hugh Jackman's portrayal of the character in general, and most of the things associated with the world and the movies that he's in. Now, I don't love the other Logan films, such as The Wolverine and X-Men Origins, but I didn't hate them either. I liked the majority of the Wolverine, but I didn't really like the cheesiness of the ending, and to be honest, I did actually quite enjoy some of the elements, some of the characters in particular, of Origins. I loved seeing the Blob finally on screen. I loved seeing some of those characters who were there with him as mercenaries who you just don't see usually in those kind of films, and although it wasn't the best of movies, of course it didn't do Deadpool much justice, I didn't hate the movie overall. Now, this is the third and final film in that kind of trilogy, but they're all different timelines, etc., so you don't really have to consider them a trilogy in that way, and this is, surprise surprise to no one, an amazing film. And to be fair, some of the things that I'm going to say, you've probably heard similar things from other people. Things like the fact that you don't have to be a fan of superhero films to enjoy it. Things like the fact that it's a modern western, with elements of movies like Unforgiven in there. Very deliberately so, and I would say in particular, Unforgiven definitely has a strong influence on this film. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Unforgiven, funnily enough. I didn't think it was a bad film, I just didn't love it as much as many of Clint Eastwood's other films. This movie, though, is without a doubt my favourite movie to see Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine in so far. And as far as things which I really enjoyed, things perhaps I didn't enjoy as much, well, first of all, for things that I did enjoy, I really liked the way that the film looked. I loved the fact that it had, as I said, that kind of modern western feel. It's a very dusty, dirty, run-down looking film. It's set in the future, but not necessarily the future that people would want. And visually, actually, it reminds me of a couple of other really good films which I like a lot, such as Cop Car, Hell or High Water, and a couple of others which also have that kind of modern western, or I would call it like a Texas kind of vibe. Of course, from the point of view of a Brit who doesn't live in that area, that kind of dusty, very open-feeling world, which is not necessarily as technologically advanced for the most part as a big city. That's how this film feels, more like the Outback, like that kind of dusty feel, which those other movies have. And that's deliberately so again, and one of the things that I like about that is that it manages to be quite minimalist, visually, but at the same time it's a very pleasant visual to have. Wide dusty fields and mountain ranges naturally look very good in pretty much any film that you feature them in, and they're used very, very well here. As far as performances, well, of course, they're going to be great. Patrick Stewart is great in everything. It was great to see Daphne Keane in her breakout role as X-23, and I have to say she is a fantastic child actor. Usually I don't have the time of day for child actors, they just annoy me, but she was great. She didn't have a huge amount to say in the film, but what she did do with her demeanour and the way she acted rather than the way she spoke is really good. She managed to have that feeling visually of a kind of pent-up rage that Logan himself has, and that the character of Wolverine has. And that was very cool to see, especially from a kid, and usually kids just don't have that kind of depth, and the fact that she did is impressive. Another thing that I found really impressive, and it's kind of a smaller thing, really, it's not, but it's not something that people think about much, and that is the portrayal of, in particular, Hugh Jackman and especially Patrick Stewart playing older than they are. Patrick Stewart looks and acts old in this film, and in real life, he's on it. Mentally, he's there, and even in recent X-Men films, he looks fine. Of course, he's an older guy, but he doesn't look or act old. In this film, he does. And Logan himself, Hugh Jackman, he's not that old, but in the film, he acts much more wearied than he actually is. And you can't discount that kind of performance. It's not easy to act old and decrepit. It's really impressive when it's done well. And when you really watch their performances in this film, you can see that. They look and act so much older than they actually are. Now, as far as story, of course I'm not going to spoil anything, and the story is pretty simple. But what the story does, and what they do with that relatively simple premise, is impressive. Because the premise itself, again, without spoiling anything that you don't see in the trailers anyway, is about Logan taking care of Patrick Stewart, and this girl comes into their lives, and Patrick Stewart, being the way he always has been, wants to try and help her out, as he always has with the kids in the school. And basically that's where the story goes. It's very simple, it has that kind of road trip slash family drama kind of vibe at times, there's horror vibes in there, there's certainly action, and although the first time I watched the film I was kind of worried that the rewatchability might take a hit because of the pacing of the film, I found it to be not slow, but a slower burn. Certainly not as slow as something like Bone Tomahawk, but slower than the previous Wolverine films where it's just place to place, action to action. This isn't as much like that. There are much more conversation pieces, there are slower moments, which are deliberate, and I don't dislike the film for that, that's what it was going for. I was just worried initially that that might hurt rewatchability. On a second viewing, it didn't. It was better the second time, and I'm glad that it was. And that's basically all you really need to know about the story and the plot of the film. The rest you can just find out for yourself. There's some fantastic acting. In fact, there's a lot of fantastic acting. Great characters, great visuals, great soundtrack. Certainly fantastic action. It's by far the most brutal we have seen Wolverine be. And that will, of course, please fans. So what then about the individual ratings and scores that I give to each film that I review? Well, first of all, we have the story and the plot. And for the story and plot of Logan, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. Because although, as I said earlier, it is fairly simple, the premise itself, the basic concept when you strip everything away, is very simple. It's a story about protection and family. But what they do with that is very impressive. So overall, based partially on the performances of the actors and the way that they furthered that plot, but also just based on how well the plot unfolded and the pace that it took itself in, it's a 9 out of 10 from me. As far as the characters, their motivations, the way they're portrayed, etc., it's a definite 10. Logan himself is fantastic, of course the standout of the film. Patrick Stewart is superb. Daphne Keane, as I already said, is fantastic. Everyone in the film is fantastic. A couple of the villains you could say maybe could have had a bit more backstory, but as with many other superhero films, in particular Marvel ones in fact, the focus is more, and has always been more, on the heroes than the villains. And in a story like this, that really works. The villains are there for a purpose. It's not about the villains. So there's certainly room, you could always say, for more backstory, but eventually you just have a bloated film if you keep on doing that. I was happy with them, I was happy with all of the characters, and I thought they were portrayed extremely well. As far as the visuals, the makeup, the special effects, etc., well again, it's a definite 10 from me. The visuals, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of scenery, the cinematography is fantastic, reminded me very much of some of my favourite films like Hell or High Water, Cop Car, that kind of thing. But also, of course, the special effects, stuff like CGI, stuff like practical effects on body damage, and of course the gore is fantastic. It's not necessarily like Saw level gore, but it's not supposed to be. It's cleaner than that. Although, to say it's clean is relative, of course. So for me, it's an easy 10 in that regard. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, the music, well earlier on I mentioned that it was good, but at the same time I didn't find it to be an amazing soundtrack. I found it to be very good, certainly well above par, but at the same time there are far better film soundtracks out there, far more memorable ones, and the soundtrack I would say did do its job very well. As I mentioned, above par, well above par, and so I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. It just wouldn't be fair though, at least for me, to rate it even higher and put it on par with films which really do have outstanding soundtracks, overly memorable soundtracks which really stay with you. You can think of films like that, stuff like Star Wars, Jaws, that kind of thing. They are very iconic as soon as they're released. With a movie like Logan though, and the soundtrack therein, It's a great soundtrack and it works for the film, but it's not the kind of soundtrack that will stand apart from the film, because it's very much tied into what you're seeing. It's a very visual story. So overall, it just wouldn't be fair as far as I'm concerned to rate it extremely high in that regard. And finally, for the most subjective, to me, the rewatchability, the entertainment of the film, I'm going to give it a 9. And the only reason why it doesn't get a full 10 is because, as I mentioned earlier, I was initially worried about the rewatchability, due to, for me personally, the start of the film in particular, where it's not slow, but I just felt like I wanted it to get going a bit more. Everything felt very, very laboured. Not the story, but the people in it. And of course that serves the plot. They're supposed to be like that. They're run down, they're older, they're not decrepit, but they're pretty close to it. And as I said, on a second viewing that was far better. However, this is a film that requires so much emotional investment, in a similar way to something like Oldboy, which is also one of my favourite movies, and I would say one of the most emotionally impactful films I've ever seen, isn't the kind of film that you can just shove in to have a bit of fun. It's just not that kind of film. Like films such as Unforgiven, Hell or High Water, it's not a popcorn movie. You could view it that way if you want to, but there are more layers to it than that, and that does kind of hurt rewatchability. It's the kind of film that when you watch it, you need to think about it, appreciate it like a piece of art, and as fantastic as that is, that just by nature means that it doesn't have the infinite rewatchability of something that's just more action-based, something like a John Wick 2, for instance, where it doesn't have the same emotional impact, it has a similar level of action, and as such you can watch it at any time and just have fun with it. This doesn't have that. This is far more powerful. And that's fantastic, I'm not complaining about that at all. It just means that you have to prepare yourself emotionally for a film like this and really think about it and get into the world. Whereas some others, you can just have fun with. So overall, it's still a 9 from me. It just doesn't feel like a full 10 in that regard for that very reason. But either way, that means that overall, I'm giving Logan, along with a couple of other movies such as Jaws, the highest rating I have ever given to a movie on this channel so far of 4.5 out of 5. That's combining the 5 scores together, and as I said, no movie has ever gone above a 4.5 on my channel so far. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a high score to get. So overall, it's pretty obvious. Of course, I would recommend checking out Logan if you get the chance. To be honest, you don't even need to be an X-Men fan, you don't need to be a Wolverine fan, you don't even need to be a fan of the films to precede it. You can come into this movie knowing nothing about Logan and enjoy it, because it's more than a film in a franchise. It's a standalone story that just works as that. It's so much more than just a superhero film. But that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.